Good morning. I feel very welcomed here in Heston after getting married here on this podium, November 4, my anniversary coming up. Susan, I haven't forgotten. I feel very welcome here in Heston for two reasons. The first is geographical. As I came here this morning, Susan and I crossed Lancaster Avenue. That Lancaster Avenue, of course, is a reference to my hometown. If I understand correctly the history of Heston, folks from my hometown of Lancaster came out here looking for good farmland, and I understand they found it. And the name of the town is Heston, meaning Hess Town, meaning the first people here this town was named after were Hesses. And when I was a kid in Lancaster, we used to go and visit Uncle Norman and Aunt Anna Hess. And I have not been able to do the genealogy, but it is my strong, who wants to let facts stand in the way of a good story? I think it's true anyway. I would like to think that my Uncle Norman Hess was very possibly related to the people after whom this town is named. So I feel very much at home here for geographical reasons, but I also feel at home here for spiritual reasons. I felt embraced and welcomed by this community, and I'm very much happy to be with you here this morning. We're speaking this morning about what has come to be called the Forever War. After the tragic events of September 11, the United States invaded Afghanistan, and we're still there. We have lost upwards beyond 3,000 young men and women. Untold numbers of Afghanis have died, and we're still there. We clearly lack the political will to get out. We keep seeing reports in the paper, and clearly the situation is we're not winning the war from a military perspective, and this drags on, and the latest is we're still going to be in Afghanistan. We find the same thing happening in Iraq. We invaded in Iraq in 2003. The situation there is in terrible shape. We continue to hear of factional discord. The situation has yet to be resolved. In Syria, we're now entering the seventh war. The United States has been an actor in that war. We've thrown kerosene on the flames of the fire there. We don't read about that much in our papers, but we have contributed. We're part of the problem, in my opinion, very clearly, rather than part of the solution. In Libya is something we don't hear very much about. You'll recall that about, 4, 5, 6 years ago, the Europeans led the invasion of Libya, and we, the United States, were sort of followed along, but we were active participants. We overthrew a really crazy guy named Muammar Gaddafi. But what do we have now? We have absolute chaos in the country of Libya. We have apparently, the best I can understand, is two governments in two different parts of the coast. And this chaos is contributing to the flow of refugees across the Mediterranean into southern Europe. In Palestine, the situation there is so painful and so difficult in Gaza, and most people around the world are coming to the conclusion that the United States is really not part of the solution there either, that we're part of the problem. So what do we do in the light of this continuing war that just seems to go on and on and on, taking more and more lives, dragging down our spirits, dragging down our lives of our military, and driving down our budget? How do we respond? I think, in the words of the first scripture, the first thing we need to do is listen to the still small voice. The prophet Elijah felt that the world was in chaos, that things had fallen apart. He fled, went out to a cave. He heard the earthquake. He heard the loud winds. He saw the fire, and the voice of God was not in those moments. I think today the equivalent of the loud earthquakes, the loud voices of the wind and the fire, is in so much of our national media. We hear very loud voices telling us, the military people tell us that more military involvement, we need some more arms. Yeah, we got to beef up our military budget. That's surely the answer. That is not the answer. Sending more military to the Middle East is not going to solve this. We hear much of what we get Our opinions are shaped by politicians. Politicians want your vote. They're going to tell you that, yeah, the American people are wise people, and we're on the right track, and yeah, let's get some more money for guns. That's not the answer either. Politicians are looking for your vote. And we're going to be hearing news on the media, and the media is looking for you to stay tuned so that you watch the commercials after the news that they present. So stay tuned for the back pain relief advertisements, and stay tuned for the toothpaste ads that are going to whiten your teeth. They don't want you to change channels, so they're not going to be presenting information to really challenge your thinking. So we're not going to find the answers in the news media, in the military, in the politicians. We need to listen to them and mixed in our voices, but so much of what we hear is not the answer. So much of it is the loud voices which were confusing to the prophet Elijah. What we need to do is listen to the still small voice. There is an answer to all of this, and we need to listen for that. I'm so happy today that our offering is going to the Christian peacemaker teams. Those are people that we need to listen to. We need to listen to people from our own Mennonite Central Committee Peace Office and the Mennonite Central Committee Middle East Office. Many of us here, all of us here, I suspect, could name the names of prominent politicians who are telling us what the answers are. And we need to listen, we need to take that into account, but can we name the names? Do you know the names of the people in Christian peacemaker teams? Do you know the names of the head of the Middle East Office of Mennonite Central Committee? These are the quiet, still voices we need to listen to. The next thing I think we need to do to help us find an end to this forever war is to fish on the other side of the boat. The story that we heard, the second scripture reading from John, 21, comes at the end of the book of John. And put yourself in the place of the author of the book of John. You've written this whole gospel, you've recorded the teachings of beloved Jesus and the disciples, and now you're trying to wrap things up, come up with a good finish. Writers among us, we're trying to wrap things up at the end of our work. So what does the author of the book of John do? He says this fishing story. Well, obviously it's not just a fishing story. It's a story about how we approach life. We can approach life with the obvious, conventional wisdom, but John says no, the mind of Christ, the way Jesus thinks, is to look at it from a different perspective. So I would invite us today, as the second thing we need to do about the forever war, is to look at it for a different perspective. We need to look at it from how people feel in the Middle East. St. Paul said, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep." And that's what we need to do. We need to start thinking more about how people in that part of the world are feeling. We have a lot of men in expensive suits in air-conditioned offices who will appear on television. They'll give you theories. But what we don't hear very much of in our national discourse is how people in the Middle East are feeling. We need to talk about feelings of the people over there. In the movie E.T., which is a movie I commend to all of you, I think it's one of the great American movies, you remember at the end of the movie, I won't give away the ending, but you'll remember near the end of the movie, E.T. is there in the hospital, and his heart is blinking, and Elliot is nearby. He got all those wires attached, remember, And when I was putting my thoughts together for this, for my sermon this morning, it suddenly occurred to me that Elliot and E.T. are similar. I never quite thought, maybe that occurred to you, but I think the parallels between E.T. and Elliot are very significant. It's very Christian, a lot of Christian messages in there. So at the near the end, the doctor says to Elliot, he says, "So you think what E.T. is thinking?" And Elliot says, "No, I feel what E.T. is feeling." And this is what we need to do to find some answers to this mess we're in, is to begin feeling what people in the Middle East are feeling. So I decided to do that. The first half of my career, I worked at Church World Service, which is sort of like Mennonite Central Committee for the Presbyterians, so to speak. Sort of like Mennonite Central Committee for the Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Methodists and Disciples, the same kind of thing. And I worked in the communications office, and I began hearing about sanctions, economic sanctions, which were hurting the children of Iraq. And I was a communications person. This was news to me. I said, let's go over and find out. So I made 2 trips to Iraq, and I was this was in the late 90s, I was so taken with what I saw, so moved by what I saw, that I quit my job and started working on a book. I've not yet published my book. If anybody here has any ins with publishers, let me know afterwards. I'm still trying to find a publisher for my book. But if we could have the first 2 slides, if we can try those out. I went to Iraq, but first let me mention that I'm one of the very few people in the whole world who has experienced bombing on both sides of this terrible divide we find ourselves in. If you think of this as 2 tectonic plates, earthquakes, they're rubbing up against each other. Out in California, people are worried that these 2 plates are sort of crunching, and every now and then they're worried about an earthquake. Well, that's sort of what's happening with the East and the West right now. We're sort of grinding these plates, and every now and then things erupt. And I happen to be one of the very few people in the world who has experienced bombing on both sides of this terrible divide. I went to visit recently, I often see, as a matter of fact, in New York City, where I live, Ground Zero. I support my work as a tour guide. I'm a part-time tour guide, and I often take tours, buses. I'm on those double-decker buses. And we often go past Ground Zero. And I was in New York City when that happened, and I can assure you it was a very, very scary thing. I was in New York City. I live about 8 or 10 miles north of Ground Zero, and I still remember the fear that we all felt. I remember the little shrines that people began putting up immediately afterwards with candles that were lit and pictures of lost ones, loved ones, and they said, have you seen this person? This person is missing. And of course, we knew this person is gone. And I also remember the smell. The smell did not reach all the way to where I live at 103rd Street, where Susan and I live. But I went to a meeting in Greenwich Village, which is about 3 miles from Ground Zero, and you could, for a week or 2 afterwards, you could smell that terrible sense. So I've experienced bombing on this side of this great divide, but I also experienced bombing in Baghdad. If we could try the next 2 slides. Here you see me on the way to Iraq, and we're here at the Iraq border with creative spelling, and here is a picture of the man who was then leading Iraq. His name is Saddam Hussein. I'd begun hearing about sanctions, economic sanctions, which were hurting the people of Iraq. And I said, I want to go and see for myself. I was so moved, I quit my job and I went there. I got there on my 3rd trip to Iraq in the first week of December, 1998. That's 20 years ago. My goodness, time flies. And I began hearing about a possible U.S. airstrike. And I said, no, Americans, they're much too smart for that. We would never do such a foolish thing. And I was busy, caught up in the mystery and magic of the Tigris River and the old city of Baghdad. I had a room overlooking the Tigris River for $5 a night. And I didn't think it was going to happen, but sure enough it did. On the night of December the 8th, I was in my hotel room on the 5th floor overlooking the Tigris River all alone. And I began hearing these distant plop, 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 plop. It was bombs, and bombs were coming towards me. And all of a sudden, I said, this can't be happening. I can't be undergoing this. This is something out of a book. Well, it was true. The bombs getting closer and closer, and suddenly everything starts crashing around me. And there I was, all alone, in my hotel room, really paralyzed, not really quite sure what to do. And the bombs were crashing all around me. And I was really very, very scared, and the phone rings. And it was the clerk, the desk clerk downstairs, Mohammed. And Mohammed says, Mr. Bell, come down to the bomb shelter. And so suddenly I was sort of freed from my trance, and I go running down the stairs and spend the next 4 nights in bomb shelters. And I was terrified. I'm a man of prayer. But I became a man of very intense prayer during those next 4 nights. I distinctly remember times when I was I changed hotels to be with my near to my Arab friend. I remember huddling in a fetal, crunched up position as the bombs fell around me, and praying and praying. And I remember the dust coming down from the ceiling. The suspended ceilings, you have the metal frames and the styrofoam or the plastic. The whole building is shaking and the dust is falling down on me. I was just terrified. I prayed and I prayed and I got through. And I'll tell you just a little bit more at the end of my comments about that. But let's go back and take that moment when the phone rings. Let's stay in that moment there for a moment. What can we learn? What did I learn about the forever war in my own very personal experience? I learned, first of all, that war is not a good thing. It's not a good thing. We have men in expensive suits sitting in air-conditioned offices in think tanks in Washington and wherever, coming up with these schemes, and they don't really take account how terrible this is. And I was there. I think God allowed me to experience that, to put the energy in me that I have now to try to stop war. So the first thing I took from that experience was that war is not a good idea. The second thing I took from that experience is that Muslims are good people. Muslims are good people. The people who were bombing me were presumably Christians. They were Americans riding their planes. They understood it from their perspective. It made sense to them. But me on the ground, it was the Christians who were giving me a hard time, and it was the Muslims in the hotel who took care of me. Let's put ourselves in the feelings for Muhammad, the desk clerk. He could have said to himself, there's that American, what is his name? That guy up there on the 5th floor. His country is attacking us without any. We know now, 20 years later, that there was no reason to attack Iraq. And he said, he might have said, let's let that American up there get a taste of his medicine. Let's just let him sit up there for a little bit. But no, the first thing he did when the bombs were coming around us, he called me up, he called me to safety. And that phone call could well have saved my life. Here's a tip: if you're ever undergoing bombing, get away from the windows, because you don't want the windows to implode and the glass shards coming in. I could have been gone. I wouldn't be standing here today if a good Muslim named Muhammad had not called and could well have saved my life. I think if Jesus were preaching today, he would tell us the parable of the good Muslim. If we go back and look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Samaritans, of course, were people who had a slightly different faith. They weren't the same as the faith of the Jewish faith, the Hebrew faith at the point. And Jesus said, nevertheless, he was the hero of the story. This person who believed differently was the hero of the story. In those days, it was the Samaritans, and there's still, I'm told, a few Samaritans today. I really believe if Jesus were back today teaching us, he would tell us the story of the good Muslims. People who are kind, people who are good, people who honor Jesus as we do. The second thing that I learned on my experience of bombing, my time in Iraq, as I traveled. Remember, there was a picture just of my visit to the Iraq border. And if we could have the next slide of the map of Iraq. Maybe I got behind myself here. Yes, these pictures, yes, these are another good Muslim that I met. Thank you. This is a very prominent imam who was at a beautiful mosque. You remember the statue of Saddam Hussein that was toppled? Well, this is the mosque that you see in the pictures right behind it. It is a major mosque. In the Christian world, we refer to tall steeple churches. You ever heard that phrase, meaning First Presbyterian of so-and-so or First Methodist, meaning a prominent church? Well, this we might call a tall minaret mosque. It's a leading mosque, very prominent, and he was very kind to me. He met me and was gracious to me. Let's move on to the map of Iraq, and this is not such a great photo of mine, but it's special to me because I got this from the Ministry of Tourism in Baghdad. They gave it to me. Here's a map of Iraq. And it's a little hard to see here, but one of the things that we need to realize is that history matters. Now, I had nothing to do with the colonization of the Middle East. It wasn't my idea and it wasn't your idea. But we as Westerners, meaning people in the Christian West, have to come to terms with this, that there was a whole history of colonization. I have a good friend who is an artist. I work with Iraqi art. I have a good friend who was a professor of art at the Art Institute of Baghdad. And he told me the story that when he was a student in high school in Iraq, they used to talk about the Gertrude Bell elbow bump and the Winston Churchill hiccup. And what he meant by that was the map that we saw. If you study a map of the Middle East, there are just these very strange borders that were drawn by Gertrude Bell, a very prominent British lady, the time of Lawrence of Arabia, and of course we all know the name Winston Churchill, who began his career in that part of the world. So on the the eastern part of Iraq follows the rivers, a natural border, but the borders on the west were simply driven by colonialists who arbitrarily drove these numbers. And in high school, the Gertrude Bell elbow bump and the Winston Churchill hiccup is what they used to describe the borders that don't make any sense. They just sort of put a ruler down and drew it there. This is what the people of Iraq grew up with. When I was a kid in Lancaster, I still remember, I've never heard of it since, but I still remember somewhere in our American history books, maybe you can remember this as well, there was something about the border with Canada, and it was something like 59-50 or fight. And we were going to say where the border was with Canada, or else we were going to fight. So I've never heard of that since, but the message to us kids was that we Americans were in control of our borders. We were a tough people. We could decide where the borders were. Nobody was going to tell us. We were going to fight. But in Iraq, if you're in Iraq, the people there are stuck with this legacy of colonialism, of somebody else telling them where their borders are. Could we, the next slide here is from the wall, the separation wall in Palestine, and if you look next to me, you'll see it says, decolonialize this sense that people have in the Middle East. Again, it's not your fault, it's not my fault, but this is the legacy of history that we have to work with, we have to come to terms with, as people there feel put upon by the West. And in Israel, of course, that's a whole other topic. And please listen to the Christian peacemaker teams. We have to find a way to find justice and kindness to the Palestinians. The policies that are in place now are simply not working, and we need to address that. The third thing I learned on my trip to Baghdad is that confession is good for the soul. Here is a picture which I took of a lady in Baghdad, the frayed furniture of the hospital, the lack of medicines on the cabinet next to her. We weren't told this. The problem with our news media is not so much fake news, there is a bit of fake news, but the real problem is the lack of news, the lack of the other side, the lack of perspective. When you went to court, you promise, we affirmed, to tell the truth, the whole truth. The truth is complex, there are different sides. And we're not told enough of what's happening. We weren't really told 20 years ago about the terrible effects that the economic sanctions were having on Iraq. And if we can take the next slide. This is a painful picture. We won't leave this up too long. This is a baby that I saw dying in Basra. I was told that in the capital, Baghdad, it was terrible enough, but there was the materials didn't reach to the outer province as well. Basra was a very, very painful place, and I saw that poor child in literally the last minutes of his life, her life. The problem was the sanctions were not allowing food to get in. The child was malnourished. There was not enough medicines. We have to admit our part of this. It's not all our fault. There's a lot of blame to go around, but we are a part of creating this problem. A year or so ago, last summer, I try to attend Shakespeare in the Park each year. It's a wonderful production. Susan and I went, and The budget is also right. It's free Shakespeare in the Park, so I try to get to that every year. A year ago, there was the play Julius Caesar presented. I hadn't seen that for a long time. And there was a bit of a kerfluffle in the press because a certain politician was compared to Julius Caesar. And for the one time in my life, I agreed with Fox News. I agreed that that wasn't a good idea to compare Julius Caesar to a certain American politician. A better comparison would be with Julius Caesar and Saddam Hussein. The premise of Julius Caesar, the message that Shakespeare gives to us in Julius Caesar is these guys set out to think we can just overthrow Caesar. He was a tough guy, apparently, made a lot of mistakes. So we just overthrow Julius Caesar, then we're going to have a wonderful time, peace on earth. Shakespeare says, ain't so. Shakespeare gave us all those wonderful lines that Shakespeare gave us. He gave us that great line, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. That's what we did. We overthrew Saddam Hussein and we let slip the dogs of war, and we're still seeing the terrible effects of that. So we have to own up to our part of this. The other thing I learned was to hold on to our own Mennonite tradition of not being conformed to the world. Those of you who are visitors, if you go back on the pictures at the back wall behind us, you'll see the old days of when the Mennonites were not conformed. We actually wore different clothing, and the ladies wore the prayer veiling. My mother wore the prayer veiling, and that puts us in simpatico with our Muslim friends who wear the hijab, in my opinion. So we have changed. We're no longer, in sociological terms, a sect. We are now a denomination, and I applaud that. I totally agree with that. But the danger is that we're going to lose the ability to not be conformed. We're going to start thinking the way everybody else thinks. St. Paul says, no, be ye not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed. That's what we need as Mennonites. We need to hold on to that sense of not just going along with what everybody else says, but being transformed. I'd like to close. I think my time is running out here. I could go on forever here. But let me close by citing one final thing that I learned during my bombing in Baghdad. I've been speaking about issues of governance and political and sociological and history and so forth. But one of the things I think we need to hold on to is our own spiritual lives, to use this challenge of the forever war to deepen our own sense of trust in God, to deepen our sense of prayer, to deepen our sense of love for people who are different from us. The picture you're seeing right now is a picture I took at a Christian church in Baghdad. This happens to be at Easter. On the third night of the bombing, I underwent 4 nights of bombing. The fourth night sort of petered out, but the third night was full force. And we all sort of knew what was going to happen. By that point, we knew the drill. The Americans start attacking after dark. So once it gets dark, look out, here comes the... it was called Desert Fox. Some of you remember Bill Clinton and his troubles. Perhaps some people speculate relating to that. Take his mind off political troubles at home, let's go over and bomb Iraq, whatever. But that was the moment. It's called Operation Desert Fox. So by the third night, we all knew the routine. And after dark, the bombs start to fall. So what do you do when you're a Christian? You go to church. So I went to church. The Catholic church, it wasn't at this church, it was a different Catholic church I happened to go to. There was Sunday evening prayer service. The third night happened to be Sunday. But because of the situation, they moved the prayer service earlier. So get your praying done, and then you get home in time, so you're in your own home, in your own basement, by the time the bombs fell. So I went to the Catholic church, and the service starts. Unlike our service today, the Catholic service, of course, is the liturgy and the Mass, which is also a wonderful way to worship. And so I'm there praying, and I was praying to God, dear Lord, I'm not ready. Give me something special, you know? I mean, the bombs are going to start falling. The buildings are going to shake. The dust is going to start falling from the suspended field. I need something, Jesus. I need something special. Give me something special. I need this. And I wasn't getting it. And the service goes on. Some more people begin to come. And in Iraq, the ladies wear the bandana as well. And I said to myself, these people look like Aunt Jane and Aunt Gladys and Aunt Ruth and Aunt Edna, the Mennonite ladies I grew up with in those days. So I felt more and more at home, but I still wasn't quite getting that special something I was looking for, and I was still very much afraid. You look out the windows, it's getting darker, and you're looking at the structure of the church, and you begin looking at structures. What would bombing do to this church structure? Those kind of thoughts are coursing through your mind. We get to the Eucharist, the communion, and I was told, our friend Rania told us, Rania and Bashar during the 9 o'clock hour, that there's a village in Syria, which I hope to visit this time, where they pray in Amharic, the language that Jesus spoke. So they used this language, and I'm listening to the Eucharist, the Lord's Prayer, in the language that Jesus spoke, and I'm still not quite getting any special thing. So the service is over. We all have to go home, back to our houses, to my hotel, wait for the bombing to start. And I had with me some Christmas cards. This Christmas card to Syria campaign is not my first effort at Christmas cards. I took about a couple dozen Christmas cards, and I had a few for the different churches I would visit, and I had about a dozen with me. And I thought to myself, is this really a good idea? Here I am, a lonely American, all alone with 12 or 14 Christmas cards. I'm going to give it to the pastor, and I'm from the country that's getting ready to drop bombs on him. I said, is this really a good idea? And I said to myself, if Christianity is good for anything, this is the moment we should try to put this to use. So I went up to the pastor. I took my Christmas cards from my Christian friends in New York, and he was very grateful, and he said, come, you got an extra minute? He said, stay for coffee. I'll give you a cup of coffee. Now, if you're in the Arab world and they offer you coffee, you're in. You're right there. So we went to the pastor's study, and he offered me coffee. If we could have the next and final slide. He said to me, the thing that about this bombing, he said, we adults don't understand it, but it's the kids who really don't understand it. They just don't understand why this is happening. And he said, pray for us, and I assured him that I would. And it was time to go, so I hailed down a taxi. Because of the sanctions, these taxis, the shock absorbers were shot, and the seats, the springs were coming out of the seat cushions, and it was bumpy and pushing me. And on the taxi back to my hotel, I suddenly realized that my prayer had been answered. My prayer had been answered through the good pastor, whose name I no longer remember. He offered me welcome. He offered me the assurance that I was loved and cared for. That's what we need to do. We need to let the people of the Middle East know that they are loved and cared for. We need to work harder to understand their point of view, to feel what they are feeling. Thank you, and God bless the good work of Heston.